The house was silent. The first rays of the sun peeped through the window curtain, spreading a peaceful warmth to the crib in the corner of the living room. While little Brian, who was lying in the crib, continued to sleep peacefully, Luis, who was waiting like a shadow with his giant size right next to him, was always on guard. Luis was a pit bull. Sometimes when people saw this breed they would get scared and stay away. But everyone who knew Luis knew and admired the tremendous love and loyalty he carried inside him. Luis had never left Brian's side since he was born. From the first day, the bond between them was so strong that they were almost like brothers. When Brian cried, Luis would not bark, he would only come to him, leaning his head gently against the crib as if to comfort him. When the baby rattled the hall with his laughter, Luis' tail would wag enthusiastically and the joy of the moment would spread to his heart. One day, a noise from outside the house caused Luis to prick up his ears. The outer door was being forced. Without a moment's hesitation, Luis stepped in front of Brian, shielding his broad chest. At that moment his instincts kicked in. It was as if he knew he was responsible for the safety of the house. As danger approached, Luis had the determination of a warrior in his eyes and the love of a mother in his heart. When the door opened, a stranger entered. However, Luis immediately recognized a family friend, whom the owner had introduced earlier, and backed away, realizing that he was not a threat. But even this brief moment showed what Luis would do for Brian. Emily, the mom, could not hold back her tears as she watched what was happening. She hugged Luis, buried in his fur, and whispered, "I'm so glad you are Luis." As the days passed, Luis and Brian's friendship grew deeper. When Brian started to crawl, Luis always walked beside him. If he fell, he pretended to pick him up immediately. When Brian threw his ball far away while playing in the garden, Luis would bring it back and gently put it in his little hands. He was not only a dog but also Brian's best friend, playmate and protector. When Brian started to walk, Luis was his shadow. He followed him wherever he went. One day in the park, when another boy was rough with Brian, Luis immediately intervened and calmed the situation with just his presence. He didn't hurt anyone, but everyone saw the seriousness and care in Luis' eyes. Mom and Dad looked proudly at each other and said, "Luis is our greatest gift." The years went by. Brian started school. When he got on the bus in the morning, Luis would always accompany him to the door, sit down and wait until Brian left. When he came back from school, he would greet him, wagging his tail enthusiastically. The bond between them never diminished, on the contrary, it grew stronger. When Brian said, "My best friend Luis," at school, his friends could not believe that he was talking about a dog. One day on the way back to school, Brian was a little sad. One of his friends made fun of him. "Luis is just a dog, what kind of a friend is he?" As soon as Brian got home, he sat down next to Luis, leaned his head against him and said, "You are my best friend, I wouldn't trade you for anyone." Luis, as always, kept his eyes fixed on Brian and put his head on his knee. At that moment, it was as if everything was silent, only a heart-to-heart connection spoke. Brian was a teenager when Luis was getting old. Every morning he fed Luis, massaged him, and they took slow walks together in the park. Luis' steps slowed, but the love in his eyes never changed. "You are my hero," Brian would say, attaching a different meaning to each of his feathers. One day, Brian picked up an old photograph of him and Luis as children. Memories flashed before his eyes one by one. The first cradle days, running around in the park watching the stars together. They all said one thing: loyalty. Luis had one goal in life: to protect Brian, to love him and never leave him alone. And he achieved it perfectly. Their story was not only the story of a boy and a dog, but also the story of a bond woven with love and strengthened over time. Luis and Brian's story was the story of the quietest but deepest friendship on earth. And as in the end of every friendship story, it was inevitable that they would remain in the memory as a legend. Luis was not just a dog. He was a companion of the heart.